Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we will be examining the history of Catholicism in the early 19th century, with a particular focus on the city of Rome itself and the tenure of the reforming Pope Pius IX. Between the 11th and the 16th centuries, the Roman Catholic Church had undoubtedly been one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. The Pope sitting in Rome oversaw a vast network of priests, bishops, and cardinals whose power was not confined by the rough borders of the various European kingdoms. Millions of peasants across the continent attended church regularly, where a service, held entirely in Latin, would reaffirm their loyalty to God and his divine representative on earth, the Pope. The giving of tithes from the poor and donations from the rich ensured that the Church grew wealthy, and indeed Renaissance Rome was a large city, if not as large as it once was in the ancient era, as well as being a centre for culture and of the arts. As well as ruling a large temporal area outside of Rome, known as the Papal States, the popes were also able to rally the European princes in vast military campaigns, the Crusades, which were directed not only towards Palestine, but also towards Constantinople, Lithuania, and even against heretics in southern France. Discontent with Catholicism came from a number of directions, stemming from issues as diverse as the interference of the Pope in regional politics and the corrupt practice of selling absolution to those who were willing to buy it. The Protestant Reformation resulted, spreading from Germany across northern Europe. The new Protestant churches rejected the authority of Rome, seeing the Pope at best as just another priest, and at worst as the devil incarnate. Catholic states, led by the mighty Spanish and Holy Roman Empires, rallied behind the Pope in the so-called Counter-Reformation. The 30 Years' War was largely thought of as a way of establishing Catholic supremacy in Europe. When this ended in a draw, Europe was left divided between a mostly Catholic south and a mostly Protestant north. The 18th century was a difficult time for the popes. Enlightenment thinkers, even in Catholic countries such as France or Austria, were able to launch fierce attacks on the Church and its overt interference into national politics. Fashionable ideas of reason and rationalism attacked the mystical elements which were still important in a Catholic Mass, which relied on ceremony to a greater degree than most Protestant than most Protestant churches did. Moreover, philosophers such as Voltaire linked Catholicism not only with superstition and ignorance, but also with political oppression and tyranny. Monarchs increasingly quarrelled with the Church, both as a means to win more power for themselves and to distance themselves from Catholic excess in the eyes of the educated public. Groups of educated men such as the Freemasons and the Illuminati were set up to replace the influence of the Church in society and usher in a new, rational world. Meanwhile, the Papal States and Rome itself became deeply corrupt and stagnant, with the city ignoring much of the outside world and falling under the domination of a small circle of aristocratic families. The independence and much of the power of the Catholic Church in France was ended following the 1789 Revolution. Notably, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, passed in 1790, attempted to subject the Church to the National Assembly. The entire Church in France was reorganized, with the authority of the Pope restricted to religious doctrines. A constitutional oath was required to be given by all members of the French clergy, most of whom refused, which sparked a decade of conflict between those who had given the oath and those who had not. All monasteries in France were destroyed, and 30,000 members of the clergy were killed. Notre Dame was transformed into a temple of reason, and the church's ancient holdings in Avignon were seized. The Pope, Pius VI, was outraged at these attacks and joined the coalition opposing the revolution. As a result, when Napoleon's forces invaded Italy in 1796, they stripped away the North Italian lands belonging to the Papal States. 2 years later, using the pretext of an anti-French riot as their excuse, French troops invaded Rome itself and humiliated Pius by dragging him back to France, where he died. Voices were now raised calling for an end of the papacy altogether, whilst a Roman Republic was established in the city of Rome. This republic was unpopular and short-lived, and Pius's death the following year ensured that Roman Catholicism now had a martyr. Catholicism was clearly not going to go extinct, leaving the new French leader, Napoleon, with a conundrum. Napoleon wished to heal the religious scars in France and Italy that had resulted from the conflicts of the 1790s. In 1801, he first signed a concordat with the new Pope, Pius VII, in which he recognized that the majority of his subjects were Catholic, and hashed out a series of compromises regarding the role of the Catholic Church in modern society. Bishops, for example, would be allowed in France, but only those nominated by Napoleon himself. Property seized from the Church was not to be returned, but the government would provide the Church with extensive financial support. The new Pope was allowed to reign in Rome until he began to renege on his promises, leading Napoleon to arrest him in 1809 and annex the Papal States into the French Empire. Following Napoleon's defeat and the break-up of his empire, Pope Pius VII was restored to power in Rome. His rule was backed by the stationing of Austrian forces throughout the length of the Italian peninsula, who also supported autocratic states in Tuscany and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Pius signed new concords with a number of states and restored the prestige of the papacy in many places, notably in South America. Papal rule in Rome itself and the Papal States was, however, repressive, particularly under Pius's successors Leo, another Pius, and Gregory. Under Leo, the situation of the Jewish Romans actively worsened when the Pope forbade his Jewish subjects from owning property and forced them to live in a ghetto. Pope Gregory deeply opposed reforms and attacked education as leading to liberty of conscience, something that he was expressly opposed to. He banned gaslighting, believing that it would strengthen the power of the bourgeoisie in the cities. The Pope's rule was thus deeply unpopular amongst ordinary people in the Papal States. To make matters worse, the Pope and the papal bureaucracy lived lavishly and extravagantly, whilst the Papal States experienced one deep financial crisis after another. Pope Gregory spent enormous amounts of money on architecture and monuments, whilst at the same time forbidding the construction of any railroads whatsoever. Popular dissent was constant, but all those openly opposing papal rule met a brutal end by hanging, hard labor, and exile. The papal secret police were greatly expanded to root out conspiracies, and a war in the shadows against secret radical societies or Carbonari and the Freemasons took place. Open insurrections broke out in 1830, 1836, 1840, 1843, and in 1845, every time being crushed by papal and Austrian armies. Such was the brutality of the papal army upon its own populace that the Austrians even had to intervene to tell it to calm down. Pope Gregory died in 1846 and was replaced by Pope Pius IX, who would go on to be the second longest ruling pope in history, beaten only by the first pope, St. Peter, whose papacy we lack any verifiable accounts of. During his days as a cardinal, Pius had developed a reputation as a liberal, and contemporaries saw his accession as ushering in an age of reform. Some observers, inspired by Pius's verbal attacks upon the Austrian occupation, even saw the new pope as the key to uniting the Italian peninsula. Unlike his predecessors, Pius did not live luxuriously, instead leading a life of relative restraint and temperance. He also did not have the backing of any of the powerful aristocratic families, and thus came across as free from outside influence. Between 1846 and 1848, Pius and his liberal justice minister Pellegrino Rossi instituted a series of reforms in the Papal States, including the dismantling of the Jewish ghetto. The reform period culminated in the passing of a new constitution in March 1848, which created two parliamentary houses, one elected and one chosen by the Pope himself. The constitution was radical in terms of the history of the Papal States and upset the Papal States' Austrian overlords, but it was unremarkable by wider European standards. Liberals and Republicans in Rome were upset in particular about the fact that ecclesiastical affairs were exempted from parliamentary interference, and that Parliament was required to abstain from interfering with the diplomatic relations of the Pope with foreign powers. Before long, voices that had once heralded Pius as the new Napoleon were now raised in anger against him. On the 15th of November 1848, Rossi was assassinated, and liberals took to the streets, calling for democracy, social reforms, and a war with Austria. The Pope was forced to flee Rome disguised as a humble priest. With Pius out of the way, an election was called for a National Assembly. As the Pope demanded his followers abstain from voting, the assembly was filled with Republicans and revolutionaries who proclaimed another Roman Republic on February 9th, 1848. The Second Roman Republic passed a series of reforms. Capital punishment was entirely abolished, freedom of religion enshrined in the constitution, and education reformed entirely. Massive levels of government spending, as well as the cutting of taxes, led to widespread inflation that tore at Rome's economy. In 1850, a French army invaded Rome and restored the Pope to the papal throne. For the next 20 years, the French Emperor, Napoleon III, would largely call the shots in the city, replacing the previous influence of the Austrians. Pius, meanwhile, went back on many of his former reforms. Unbelievably, Jewish Romans were now forced back into the ghetto, and much of the old judicial and economic corruption returned. At the same time as he restored his rule in Italy, Pius ensured that his power over Catholics throughout the world was strengthened. During the latter part of his reign, Ultramontanism, the centralization of the Church around papal authority, reached its peak in the modern age. In 1854, for example, the Pope flexed his doctrinal muscles by declaring in a papal bull that the Virgin Mary had been without original sin from the moment that she was conceived. This dogma of the Immaculate Conception paved the way for open reverence of Mary in the Catholic Church, but it is notable here in the way that it resulted from the will of the Pope rather than the usual collaborative process by which Catholic dogma are created. 10 years later, the Pope again acted in an authoritarian manner, issuing the so-called syllabus, in which he condemned various trends of modern times, including socialism, civil marriage, and secular education. The syllabus was undoubtedly an attack against liberalism, science, democracy, and tolerance. This unilateral action by the Pope resulted in opposition from figures who asked whether it was right of the popes to make such wide decisions. As a result, in 1869, After the Papal States had been greatly reduced in size by the conquests of the new Kingdom of Italy, the First Vatican Council came together in Rome. At this council, the dogma of papal infallibility was proclaimed, meaning that the Pope's word on a subject was now officially the Church's word. In a twist of fate, this newfound power over his flock came at just a time when the Papal States were officially dissolved, thanks to an Italian invasion in 1870. This heralded a new period of Church history, with the Vatican and the Italian state not reaching a compromise with one another until 1929.